Mark Kingsley didn't think twice when he inherited the land. It came to him not as a surprise, but as an inevitable passing of something once loved, now left behind. His uncle, Samuel Kingsley, had owned the 3-acre parcel at the far edge of town for as long as Mark could remember. A stretch of quiet earth that bordered an old nature reserve on one side and a sparse residential development on the other. Unlike the polished lots with white fences and patio grills, Sam's land had no adornment, no front lawn, no driveway, just raw soil, thickets of brush, and a stand of stoic cedar trees leaning inward like an audience waiting for the curtain to rise. Mark hadn't visited the property in years, not since he was in his 30s, but when the lawyer called and read the will, the only words that resonated were, "Left in full to my nephew Mark." At 58, Mark didn't romanticize land ownership the way he once might have. He had lived a life of quiet structure, 2 decades as a federal security contractor, then another 10 running logistics for a regional rail company before retiring early. His days were now split between a modest townhouse on the east side of town and weekend drives in his old but reliable truck. He wasn't married anymore, and his only son had long since moved overseas, lost in the tech world somewhere in Singapore or Taiwan. The land felt like a project, something tactile, something real, a place to work the body, even if the heart wasn't entirely in it. He didn't intend to build anything, not yet. Maybe clear it, get it surveyed again, plant a few trees, maybe even set up a storage shed if he felt ambitious. Something to keep the blood moving. The first visit was uneventful. He drove out with his thermos, a pair of gloves, and a collapsible chair. The gate was still rusted shut, untouched since Sam last padlocked it nearly a decade ago, and Mark had to cut it open with bolt cutters. Beyond the gate, the land was largely the same, wild and untamed. He spent the weekend clearing fallen branches and cutting down small dead trees, marking out a rough perimeter with flag stakes. No one bothered him. A couple of joggers passed by on the adjacent trail, and one elderly woman walking her dog offered a faint wave, but otherwise the place felt isolated, which was just what Mark wanted. He slept in his truck that night with the windows cracked and the sound of night birds filling the silence between thoughts. When he left Sunday evening, tired but satisfied, he didn't notice anything unusual. Not yet. The second visit came a week later, and that was when the change began to show. As he pulled up to the access point, a gravel shoulder barely wide enough for his truck, he saw something new. A wooden post had been driven into the ground just past the old gate, and on it was mounted a hand-painted sign. Community Beautification in Progress. Please respect shared spaces. The words were stenciled in bright pastel blue, framed with cartoon daisies, and affixed with screws so deep the wood splintered at the edges. For a moment, Mark thought it might be a mistake. Maybe the sign was meant for the neighboring lot, or maybe it was just someone being a little too ambitious with their flower project. He pulled the sign out with a grunt and tossed it in the back of his truck, annoyed but not yet angry. That night, he wrote a polite email to the municipal district office, asking whether there had been any community-sponsored initiatives involving his parcel of land. He attached a copy of the deed, scanned from the lawyer's original package, and mentioned the sign. The response came 2 days later. It was brief, bureaucratic, and unsettling. Your inquiry has been forwarded to the Neighborhood Council for review. Please be advised that recent rezoning efforts have affected multiple parcels in your area. You will be contacted if further action is required. Rezoning. The word sat heavy in Mark's chest, like a slow-forming bruise. He knew that term. It had teeth. He replied immediately, asking for clarification and details, what parcels, what timeline, who approved it, but he didn't get an answer. The next weekend, when he returned, he found the real answer waiting for him in the soil. The entrance to the lot had been cleaned, scraped, and leveled with fresh gravel. Someone had installed 2 identical benches at the north corner facing the woods, and between them was a plaque. He approached it cautiously, unsure whether to feel violated or simply confused. The plaque read, Karen Valley Pocket Park, built by neighbors for neighbors, sponsored by the Neighborhood Council. He blinked. Karen Valley. The words sounded fictional, like something out of a suburban satire, and yet there it was, chiseled into brass and bolted into the stone. He looked around. There were solar lights buried into the edges of the walking path and a trash can with a decorative cover. There were even planters, 3 of them, filled with blooming petunias and what looked like lavender. It wasn't just a prank. This was organized. This was deliberate. Someone had claimed his land and turned it into a park. He called the local precinct, who bounced him to the zoning office, who told him to contact the neighborhood council, who suggested he bring his concern to the monthly public forum. That forum, he would later learn, was chaired by a woman named Karen Hayes, a large, commanding presence with a talent for platitudes and a reputation for railroading property proposals through by appealing to community spirit. Mark didn't know her yet, but when he saw her photo on the council's website, her smiling face framed by a pale lavender blazer and a quote beneath it reading, Building Stronger Together, he felt a quiet, instinctive tension settle between his shoulder blades. He had known people like her, people who used rules as weapons and bureaucracy as camouflage. He returned to the property again that Thursday. The sign was back. So were the benches, the gravel, and now a laminated schedule of community gatherings affixed to a new wooden bulletin board planted near the cedar grove. He stood there for a long time, arms crossed, then slowly turned, walked back to his truck, and sat behind the wheel for almost 20 minutes. He didn't start the engine. He didn't move. The old tension from his contracting years, the one that prickled at the back of his skull when something wasn't right, had returned. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a maneuver, and someone, somewhere, had decided that he didn't count. He went home that night and pulled out the deed again. He read it 3 times. He checked the parcel number against the county land registry, and it matched. He owned that land outright and uncontested. He called the lawyer who handled the inheritance, who confirmed again in writing that nothing had changed. But when he called the zoning department and asked to speak to someone about the recent changes to the area, he was told that records are being updated and that community-led projects are being prioritized in the Green Integration Initiative, which meant nothing to him and explained even less. He sent letters. He sent certified mail. He hand-delivered a packet to the council's office with photographs and maps. He even visited the office in person, where a young woman behind the front desk smiled and told him someone would get back to him as soon as possible. No one did. 2 weeks later, a new addition appeared on his property, a gazebo painted cream with a fake bronze dedication in honor of the Lawson family, pioneers of the West Ridge community. Mark had never heard of the Lawsons. The land, as far as he knew, had belonged to his Uncle Sam for over 40 years. But the plaque suggested otherwise, and when he looked up the name later that evening, he found an old council record describing the land as formerly undeclared green space. Something snapped. He wasn't a man given to emotion, but sitting in the dark with that plaque burned into his memory, Mark Kingsley felt something settle in his chest. Not anger, not confusion, but a sharp, focused certainty. Someone had moved the line, not metaphorically, literally. And now they were rewriting the story of that land while the real owner was still alive, still present, and still watching. If they thought he was going to fade into the background, they'd chosen the wrong man. The old instincts were awake now, and for the first time in years he felt like he had something worth defending. And he would defend it. Not with noise, not with protests or lawn signs or angry emails, but with precision, with patience, and with the full weight of the law, wherever it still mattered. They had taken the first move. Now it was his. The Monday after the gazebo appeared, Mark took a personal day. He drove straight to the county records office before it even opened, parked outside with his coffee still steaming in the cup holder, and waited. When the doors unlocked at 8 sharp, he was the first one in, his boots echoing on the tile floor. The clerk at the records desk, a thin man in a shirt 2 sizes too big, greeted him with the weariness of someone already 3 hours into a job he hated. Mark remained calm, courteous, and exact. He requested the full parcel history of his land, including any changes to zoning status, designations under community initiatives, or claims filed under recreational conversion programs. He used their language, their terms. It took almost an hour, but eventually the clerk handed over a printed report that spanned 8 pages. As Mark flipped through it at the standing desk, something strange caught his attention. 6 months earlier, around the time he'd been finalizing probate, there had been an internal notation logged under the parcel ID. It read, "Inactive status, pending civic review, public use potential, high. Temporary designation, Tier 2, Green Zone, under review by NC." NC stood for Neighborhood Council. His land had been flagged for review before he even set foot on it. He turned the page and saw another note, time-stamped 2 months later. Accepted into Community Green Reclamation Pilot, Phase B. See Rec Doc, Dijru 1-2Q27. There was no mention of the actual owner being notified, no record of any mailings, just a sterile administrative trail that led straight to the situation he was standing in now. He took photos of the documents with his phone, then asked to purchase certified copies. The clerk, visibly annoyed by the extra work, printed and stamped each page. Mark thanked him, tucked the envelope under his arm, and walked out without another word. By the time he got back into his truck, a low, tight headache had begun to bloom at the base of his skull. He didn't go home. Instead, he drove straight to the law office that had handled his uncle's estate. The receptionist tried to stall him with polite deflection, but Mark insisted. Eventually, the attorney, Angela Rourke, sharp-suited and perpetually in motion, came out to meet him. She wasn't pleased to be cornered, but when Mark laid the records on her conference table and explained what had happened over the past few weeks, her demeanor shifted. She read every page, line by line, the way lawyers do when they sense exposure. When she looked up, her voice was measured but firm. "What they've done isn't technically illegal, yet," she said. "They're operating under administrative assumptions, gray area, but they're way out over their skis." Mark didn't need metaphors. He needed action. He asked her what legal options he had. She laid it out plainly. There was no single silver bullet. He couldn't sue the council directly, not without a formal claim of damages, but he could challenge the designation. He could file an appeal with the municipal zoning board. He could demand an injunction on the basis of improper notification and misappropriation of private property for public use. He could begin building a case that, in time, might force them to back down. "It'll take time," she warned, "and it'll draw fire. They'll push back, hard." Mark just nodded. He was used to long fights, and if this one needed to happen, so be it. He left the office with a to-do list and a manila folder packed with stamped forms. The first step was filing a land status challenge. It required not only a copy of his deed and zoning documents, but also photographic proof of unauthorized development and a sworn statement of occupancy intent. He'd never thought he'd be sitting in a government office swearing under penalty of perjury that he intended to mow grass and dig fence posts on land he already owned. But that was the world now. A world where ownership was more of a suggestion unless you were loud, litigious, and well-documented. By the end of the week, Mark had filed the challenge, mailed registered letters to the council, the zoning board, and the Parks and Public Use Division. He also hired a licensed surveyor to reconfirm his property lines, an expense he resented but knew was necessary. That Saturday, he returned to the property to begin removing what he legally could. He started with the trash cans, dragging them out to the road and loading them into the truck bed. He took down the bulletin board next, wrenching its base out of the soft earth with a crowbar, then tossing the whole thing into the gravel like a fallen signpost from a battlefield. It wasn't violence. It was reclamation. He was halfway through removing the solar path lights when he heard a car door slam. Turning, he saw a silver crossover idling at the entrance, and from the driver's side stepped a woman. She was heavy-set, perhaps in her early 60s, with tightly curled blonde-gray hair and a floral scarf that fluttered as she marched toward him with theatrical purpose. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't have to. This was Karen Hayes, chairwoman of the neighborhood council, the general of this suburban campaign. "You're trespassing," she said, breathless but firm. "I own this land," Mark replied without looking up, pulling another solar spike out of the dirt. "You're removing public property. That's a crime. It was placed here without my consent. That's also a crime." Karen crossed her arms, glaring at the truck filled with disassembled community cheer. "You don't understand what you're doing. This isn't just about you. This park serves dozens of families, seniors, children. You think they'll just sit by while you tear it down?" "I'm not tearing down a park," Mark said, finally rising to his full height. "I'm reclaiming my land." She stepped closer, too close. Her perfume was heavy and floral, like the signposts. That land was idle for years. The community made it useful. If you have a problem, you should have brought it up months ago. "I didn't know what you were doing until I found a gazebo on my property," he said, "and now I've brought it up." She didn't blink. "The community supports this project. You're one man. One man doesn't get to block progress." Mark didn't respond. He didn't need to. He turned back to his work and she watched him, lips tightening. After a moment, she walked back to her car, started it with a rough twist, and peeled away with a squeal that didn't match the vehicle's horsepower. The next morning, a formal complaint appeared on his doorstep at home, a letter from the council, citing him for removal of community-installed infrastructure, demanding an immediate cease and desist, and threatening civil penalties. It was signed by Karen Hayes herself. He took the letter, scanned it, and forwarded it to his lawyer. Angela responded with a single line, "This is exactly the leverage we needed." Mark understood then that this wasn't just going to be a property dispute. It was going to be a campaign, a full-court press designed to wear him down until he gave up, gave in, or went away. They were going to fight him in meetings, on paper, and in the court of a local opinion. They were going to twist facts, rewrite histories, and bury him in process until exhaustion became consent. But what they didn't know, what Karen didn't understand, was that Mark Kingsley wasn't the kind of man who disappeared quietly. He'd spent his entire life navigating conflict, bureaucracy, and bad faith actors. And unlike them, he didn't need applause. He didn't need a bench named after him. He just needed the truth and a path to prove it. They had made this personal. Now it would become official. Mark had lived through enough bureaucratic knife fights to know the first blow rarely landed clean. It wasn't the complaint letter that rattled him, or even the veiled threat of fines. That was predictable, even laughable. What got under his skin was how quickly the story shifted. Within days of the confrontation with Karen Hayes, subtle but deliberate changes began appearing online and in local channels. The community board's digital bulletin, which he'd only discovered through a link buried on the city's website, now featured a smiling group of residents standing beside the gazebo, under the heading, "Preserving our shared spaces. Below the photo, a caption read, "Thanks to the continued generosity of our neighborhood council members, the Caron Valley Pocket Park remains a sanctuary for local families. Despite recent opposition, we remain committed to preserving this gift for future generations." It was calculated. No names, no accusations. But anyone who lived within a 3-block radius knew who recent opposition referred to. The implication was clean and cruel. Mark was the problem, a holdout, a selfish figure standing in the way of children's laughter and retired folks doing Tai Chi under cedar trees. The fact that those trees were on land he legally owned and maintained with his own time and tools was irrelevant. The narrative was shifting, and he wasn't invited to the writer's room. He called Angela, who sounded less concerned than he felt. "Let them talk," she said. "Your filings are in motion. Just keep doing what you're doing. Document everything. Photograph any new changes. Forward me every letter. And stay visible. Don't disappear. They'll twist that, too." Mark didn't respond, but he knew what she meant. In cases like this, silence was painted as guilt. So, he kept showing up. Every weekend, without fail, he drove to the property, parked on the gravel shoulder, and walked the perimeter like it was a fence line in a war zone. Sometimes he worked, mowing, cutting brush, reinforcing the gate with a new padlock. Other times he just sat in a folding chair under the cedar trees and read, letting anyone watching know that he wasn't going anywhere. On the third weekend, he arrived to find bright orange construction tape strung between the trees in the southern quadrant of the lot. A wooden stake had been hammered into the dirt, and attached to it was a laminated sheet with the heading, "Future Site of the Caron Valley Educational Pavilion, Estered and Completion, Fall." Mark stared at it for a long time, not moving. A breeze rustled the branches overhead, and in the distance he could hear the muffled sound of kids playing. The brazenness of it made his skin crawl. There was no permit number listed, no approval stamp, just the arrogance of assumption. He ripped the sign down without a word, folded the stake in half across his knee, and walked it back to his truck like a soldier carrying a fallen flag. Then he photographed everything, every angle, every trace. He sent it all to Angela, who didn't respond until the next day. Her message was brief. "They just gave us ammunition." The following week, a notice was delivered to his personal mailbox. Not the property, but his actual home address. It came in a white envelope stamped with the seal of the Parks and Beautification Subcommittee, and inside was a list of infractions attributed to his uncooperative behavior. Obstruction of community development, destruction of temporary community property, unauthorized removal of signage, and violation of neighborhood cooperative norms. It wasn't a fine, not technically, but it read like a court summons. At the bottom, it requested his mandatory presence at the next council session, where the issue would be discussed in public. No signature, just a time, a date, and a line reading. Failure to appear may result in escalation. Mark leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. It was beginning. He arrived at the meeting early. It was held in a converted church hall near the center of town, the kind with white-painted bricks, uncomfortable plastic chairs, and faded linoleum floors that creaked under the weight of old grievances. A plastic folding table at the front held a pitcher of lukewarm water and a stack of agendas printed on cheap paper. There were about 40 people seated when Mark arrived, some elderly, some middle-aged couples, and a few young parents juggling kids and clipboards. Karen stood at the front, holding court with her trademark lavender blouse and that faux humble posture of someone about to sentence a man while reminding him she was praying for his soul. When the meeting began, it moved quickly. Budget updates, road repaving, community garden notes, all the usual filler. Then Karen shifted gears. We now move to Item 6C on the agenda, Community Use of Parcel 7B. A few murmurs in the crowd, She smiled sweetly. As most of you know, Parcel 7B has been the site of our beloved Caron Valley Pocket Park for over 2 months. However, recent complications have arisen regarding property status. We'd like to open the floor to discussion. No one said Mark's name, but every eye turned toward him. He rose slowly, feeling every joint in his legs resist. He cleared his throat, then spoke, not loudly, but clearly. My name is Mark Kingsley. I inherited Parcel 7B from my uncle last year. I am the sole and legal owner of the property in question. No part of it has been sold, leased, or offered for public use. The installations placed on that land were done so without my knowledge, permission, or consent. Karen nodded as if she were listening, but her expression never changed. I've filed official challenges with the zoning board. Mark continued. All construction on the parcel should be halted until those reviews are complete. Continuing development may constitute trespassing and liability for damages. Karen raised a hand gently. Thank you, Mr. Kingsley. We appreciate your input. I'd like to remind everyone that while the legal aspects are under review, our council remains focused on the well-being of the community. Our goal is not confrontation, but collaboration. Someone in the audience clapped. Just one person. Then a few others joined uncertainly. Mark didn't flinch. He sat back down, jaw tight, hands folded. The rest of the meeting was a blur. He barely heard it. When it ended, Karen approached him with a smile that never reached her eyes. That was very dignified, Mark, she said. I hope you understand that resistance is always hardest in the beginning, but once you let go, things get easier. Mark didn't answer. He walked past her, past the whispering crowd, and out into the night, where the air smelled like cut grass and chlorine. He sat in his truck for a while, watching people drift back to their cars. That single clap echoed in his ears, and for the first time since this began, he felt the full shape of what he was up against. It wasn't just Karen. It wasn't even the council. It was the myth of consensus. The soft coercion of everyone else agrees. The guilt of being the lone holdout while 100 smiling faces lined up to tell him how much better things were now. He wasn't surprised when he got the letter 2 days later. This one came certified, signed, and sealed. It was from a legal representative of the neighborhood council, requesting that he voluntarily transfer stewardship rights of Parcel 7B to the community trust for a period of no less than 20 years. In exchange, the council would offer a modest stipend, public recognition, and relief from further obligations. The letter was thick with veiled threats, references to precedent, to future ordinances, to community charter updates. It was a ransom note disguised as a handshake. Mark didn't respond. He scanned the letter, forwarded it to Angela, and then went out back to Chopwood until his arms trembled. That evening, he poured a drink, sat at his kitchen table, and pulled out a yellow legal pad. At the top, he wrote, "Next moves." Then he made a list. He would not go quietly. 3 weeks passed without a single call, letter, or email from Karen or the council. On the surface, things were quiet, but Mark wasn't naive enough to believe that silence meant surrender. He'd seen this before. People pulling back not because they were finished, but because they were regrouping. He continued his routine without pause. He visited the property every few days, checking for new signs of interference. The benches were still there, as was the gazebo, but no new structures had appeared. At first, he took that as progress. But when his surveyor, a soft-spoken man named Brett, finally returned with the updated site map, Mark noticed something odd. The northeastern edge of his lot, where the land dipped toward the trail, was marked with a dotted line. Not a boundary, but a pending review perimeter. When asked, Brett shrugged. "It's part of the zoning notes. I pulled it directly from the municipal archive. It means they're considering reclassifying that section. Mark stared at the line. That portion of the land wasn't even accessible without cutting through heavy brush, and yet now it was under review? He took the paperwork, thanked Brett, and returned home, where he spent the better part of the night digging through the city's online portal. After 3 hours and 17 different PDF downloads, he found what he was looking for: a proposal submitted 6 months earlier, buried in a public planning report for Phase 2 expansion of recreational access. Among the footnotes was a line identifying underutilized fringe parcels adjacent to civic pathways as suitable for integration. Parcel 7B was listed in a supplemental index. The authors of the report? The Council's Land Use Liaison and the Parks Initiative Coordinator, neither of whom had ever contacted him directly. He didn't call his lawyer this time. Instead, he drove downtown the next morning and walked straight into the Office of State Community Oversight. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't demand to see a director or threaten to go to the press. He simply requested an appointment with a compliance auditor. The receptionist gave him a form. He filled it out. He was calm, concise, and exact. 2 days later, he received a call from an investigator named Carla Maddox, who scheduled an intake interview for the following week. "Bring documentation," she said. "Everything you have." Mark didn't ask for a faster date. He didn't push. He just said, "Thank you," and hung up. He knew that timing in bureaucracy mattered less than accuracy. By the time the day of the interview arrived, Mark had compiled a binder 2 inches thick. Deeds, surveys, correspondence, photographs, digital records, even screen captures of the online posts Karen's counsel had made. He entered the office building in a buttoned shirt and clean boots, walked up to the 3rd floor, and introduced himself to the receptionist. Maddox met him 5 minutes later, a tall woman with a gray braid and an expression carved from granite. She didn't waste time on small talk. She walked him into a small room with a metal table and 2 chairs, and once they were seated, she opened a fresh notebook and said, "Start from the beginning." Mark laid it all out. He told her about the sign, the gazebo, the confrontation, the council meeting, the letter proposing a transfer of stewardship. He explained how the zoning documentation had shifted beneath his feet without any notification. He spoke plainly, without embellishment, but with the clarity of a man who had built his case brick by brick. Maddox listened the way a good investigator should, quietly, without interruption, nodding only when necessary. When he was finished, she closed her notebook and sat back. "This happens more often than you'd think," she said, "especially in towns where local boards have too much reach and not enough oversight. They move fast, assume ownership where there is none, and by the time anyone fights back, the narrative's already been rewritten." She tapped her pen once against the binder. "This will help. A lot." "What happens now?" Mark asked. "We'll review your documentation," she said. "We'll open an inquiry, discreetly. You won't hear anything for a little while. That's by design. But if what you're telling me lines up with the paper trail, you'll be hearing from us again. Probably with a follow-up interview and a formal site review." Mark nodded. That was all he needed. When he returned to his property that weekend, something had changed. The gazebo was still there, but the benches had been repainted. The lavender tones were gone, replaced with dark green, and stamped onto the wood was a new symbol, a leaf encircled by stars, the logo of the local Parks and Rec Department. It wasn't graffiti. It was printed, stenciled, official-looking. Someone was attempting to legitimize what had been done, rewriting the visuals to match a different story. He took photos again and sent them to Carla. She replied the next day. "Good catch. This helps. Do not remove anything. Let us handle it." A week passed, then 2, then 3. Mark continued his visits, his documentation, his quiet defiance, and then, one afternoon, a white SUV pulled onto the shoulder while he was walking the lot. A woman stepped out, blazer, clipboard, state badge. "Mr. Kingsley?" she asked. "Yes." "I'm with State Oversight," she said. "We're beginning the initial property inspection. I'll need to take some photographs, check parcel borders, and verify installations. This won't take long." Mark stepped aside. He didn't ask questions. He watched as she moved efficiently through the area, snapping photos of the gazebo, measuring distances, and writing notes. When she finished, she turned to him and said, "We'll be in touch. This doesn't look good for them." Mark nodded once, then watched her drive away. For the first time since this began, he felt something solid under his feet, something firmer than paper, firmer than plans. He didn't know how long the process would take, but he knew now that he wasn't alone. And, more importantly, they weren't unchecked. The silence that followed wasn't ominous this time. It was the sound of a new tide turning. Mark should have known the quiet wouldn't last. The state investigator's visit had clearly spooked someone, and the changes came not in thunderclaps but in the rustling of legal brush. Small, deliberate, and meant to feel procedural rather than retaliatory. The first was a notice of administrative review filed by the neighborhood council claiming that his parcel was part of a transitional green overlay zone, which, according to their own invented bylaws, allowed for semi-permanent public use of any private land deemed neglected, unstructured, or otherwise underdeveloped in the public interest. It was pure fabrication, no legal standing, no precedent, but it was written with enough official jargon to sow confusion and to buy time. Angela, now looped into every move, called it a delaying tactic with teeth, the kind of document that didn't win court battles but could gum a case to death through red tape and half-credible posturing. She told him to hold steady. They were stalling because they were losing. But Mark had been in this long enough to know that desperation could turn dangerous, and he was right. 3 days after that notice, someone entered the property overnight. Nothing was stolen. Nothing was broken. But his old lock, the new padlock he'd installed just weeks earlier, was gone, replaced with a shiny brass one that wasn't his. There were fresh footprints in the gravel, and the chain across the gate had been repositioned, like someone had taken care to make it look untouched. He didn't call the police. There was no point. Instead, he took photos, documented everything, and had the lock removed by a private locksmith who confirmed it had been installed no more than 24 hours earlier. It wasn't random. It was a message. They could come and go as they pleased. They still believed the ground beneath his boots was negotiable. Mark installed trail cameras the next morning, placing them deep in the tree line, high in the branches, and aimed not just at the entrance, but at the narrow footpaths Karen's volunteers liked to use. If they were going to escalate this into games of intimidation, he was going to escalate the response with evidence. Angela agreed. "Keep them in the dark," she said. "Let them think you're waiting for the system to save you. Meanwhile, we build the case that'll burn their house down from the inside." Mark wasn't the burning type, but he understood the sentiment. This wasn't about confrontation anymore. It was about attrition. And just as that realization settled in, the council made their next move. Something neither he nor Angela expected. The following week, he was served with a civil nuisance complaint. Not by mail, not by a polite note on a door, but by a private process server who arrived at his home mid-afternoon in a white SUV, rang the bell, and handed over a thick manila envelope with the sort of rehearsed neutrality that screamed conflict. Inside was a multi-page document alleging that Mark's disruption of designated public space had created a pattern of community distress, referencing verbal altercations with volunteers, intentional removal of safety features, and willful degradation of a shared community asset. There were no signatures from neighbors, no affidavits, just generic references to multiple complainants, and one heavily doctored image of Mark removing a bulletin board with the caption, "Property damage in progress." Angela reviewed the filing and scoffed. "It's performative, designed to intimidate you, but it does mean they're doubling down." The hearings were scheduled 2 weeks out, and in the meantime, Karen and her counsel didn't sit still. Flyers began appearing on local notice boards, gas station cork boards, and even slipped under windshield wipers at the grocery store. "Stop the destruction of our park," they read in bold, blocky font, with a photo of the gazebo and the same tired phrase. One man shouldn't erase years of progress. Mark kept collecting them. He didn't engage. He didn't tear them down. He let them talk. He let them organize. And then, quietly, he began contacting other landowners around the edges of the district, people whose lots had been similarly absorbed, challenged, or reclassified under the same park's initiative language. What he found surprised even him. Some had given up years ago. Some had no idea their land had been used. One older man, a former trucker named Doyle, told Mark that he'd only found out his property was being used as part of a nature corridor after his nephew tried to list it for sale and discovered it had been flagged as environmentally protected. Another, a woman named Liza, who owned a half-acre lot near the river, said that she was never contacted at all but had seen benches and a bike rack installed as a donation by the community. "I didn't fight it," she said, "didn't think I could. I figured if they were already putting stuff down, I must have missed something." Mark took notes on everything, passed the details to Angela, and within days she had expanded their formal complaint into a broader petition for investigation. What had started as a personal case was now a documented pattern of misuse, one that implicated the council not just in zoning irregularities, but in a coordinated effort to assume control of unmonitored land under the guise of civic improvement. That changed the tone. That changed everything. And it was then, right when they were gaining ground, that the intimidation turned personal. Mark arrived at the property on a Thursday morning to find deep gouges in the ground where his truck normally parked. The soil had been deliberately torn, not by rain or runoff, but by something mechanical, thick treads like a backhoe or grader. The cedar grove had been stripped of its flag markers, and someone had thrown a pile of half-burned pamphlets into the center of the clearing, along with a used paint bucket and several bent nails. It wasn't sabotage. It was a temper tantrum, left like a gift. Then came the note, duct taped to the inside of his truck's rear window. It wasn't handwritten. It was printed in bold, block letters on a sheet of copy paper. "You're not welcome. You're costing us more than you think." Mark peeled it off, folded it once, and tucked it into his glove compartment. He didn't tell anyone. Not yet. The next day, Carla Maddox called from State Oversight. Her voice was calm but clipped. "We finished our preliminary report. I can't share details yet, but you'll want to be present at the next city board meeting. We'll be issuing findings in open session." Mark asked her one thing. "Do I need to be worried?" She paused for a moment. "You need to be ready. That's all I can say." So he prepared. He reviewed every document, every statement, every photograph. Angela helped him draft a response packet in case he was called upon. He expected a room of faces, some angry, some confused, all of them misinformed. He expected Karen to take the floor with her signature blend of concern and condescension. But what he didn't expect, what made him sit forward in his chair with a sharp inhale, was the moment when Carla walked to the podium and said the words, "Our investigation has identified multiple procedural violations, several of which suggest intentional misconduct by the neighborhood council in the acquisition and use of private property. The silence that followed was absolute, not the hush of anticipation, but the vacuum that comes when people realize the ground they're standing on is no longer stable. Carla continued, "We have submitted a full report to the county auditor's office, as well as the state attorney general's land use division. This matter is now under formal review for civil penalties and administrative suspension." Mark didn't move. He watched Karen's face go from composed to pale in seconds. For the first time, she wasn't in control. She wasn't smiling, and she wasn't prepared. Outside, when the meeting adjourned, a few council members broke off quickly, walking toward their cars with urgent whispers and stiff shoulders. Karen remained behind, standing alone at the foot of the steps, arms crossed, eyes scanning the parking lot like a general with no troops left to order. Mark walked past her without speaking, and for the first time in months he didn't feel like the one being chased. He felt like the storm finally had a direction. The days following the board meeting unfolded with a strange quiet that didn't feel like peace. It felt like the air just before a pressure drop, like the stillness between the ignition of a fuse and the moment the fire reaches the charge. Mark continued his routine, but there was a shift in how people looked at him, in how the council communicated, or rather, didn't. The flyers stopped. The emails dried up. Karen, who had once made herself omnipresent in local forums and posts, vanished from public view. But the silence wasn't relief. It was calculation. Something was happening behind closed doors, and even with the state's investigation widening and the Attorney General's office requesting further documentation from the city, Mark knew the real storm had yet to land. He kept the pressure up. Angela doubled down on their filings, not just pushing for a reversal of all zoning misclassifications, but demanding compensation for the interference, the slander, and the attempted seizure of use rights. She called it setting a legal precedent. Mark called it reclaiming his damn life. When the summons arrived for the council's disciplinary hearing, scheduled at the county level, Angela didn't look surprised. She told Mark to wear a jacket, keep his answers tight, and let her do most of the talking unless directly addressed. They'll try to downplay, divert, deflect, but this time, they're not in front of their cheering squad. They're in front of professionals who know how to read through politeness. The hearing room was larger than expected, wood-paneled with a ceiling too high for the bureaucracy it contained. Rows of chairs sat facing the county panel, 5 members in formal attire, each one with a nameplate and a file thicker than a Bible. Karen arrived late. She walked in with a sharp suit that looked more like armor than fashion, flanked by a lawyer from a firm Angela had already flagged as one of those that specialized in community mediation, which often translated to finding creative ways to say, "we." Didn't mean to do it while burying culpability in good intentions. The session opened with procedural formalities, then shifted into statements. Carla Maddox from the state office read directly from the findings. Unauthorized reclassification of land parcels without due notice. Improper use of non-certified planning language to simulate legal designations, and willful misrepresentation of landowner consent through unrecorded community surveys that carried no legal standing. As she spoke, a slide projector cast images of the signs, the painted benches, and the laminated flyers onto a screen behind the panel. It was surreal to see months of tension displayed in PowerPoint format, but Mark sat still, jaw set, hands folded in his lap. Karen's attorney argued next. Predictably, he emphasized community benefit, the spirit of volunteerism, the supposed vagueness of municipal language. He admitted to missteps in communication, but denied any intent to override ownership rights. He painted Karen as a servant of the people, caught between the complex tides of local enthusiasm and outdated zoning policy. At one point, he actually used the phrase visionary civic optimism. Mark didn't flinch, but Angela leaned close and whispered, "They're spinning. That's good. It means they're losing." Then Karen was asked to speak. She stood, hands folded before her like a preacher addressing a wary flock. She didn't apologize. She didn't admit to anything concrete. Instead, she spoke of her years of service, her love for the neighborhood, and the genuine heartbreak she felt watching the community's work be undone. "We only wanted to create something beautiful," she said, her voice carefully trembling. "We didn't know." One of the county panelists interrupted her gently but firmly. "Mrs. Hayes, you submitted a sworn affidavit last year claiming that Parcel 7B had no active owner and was, in your words, available for community cultivation. Were you aware at that time that a deed existed in Mr. Kingsley's name?" Karen hesitated. "I had no way of verifying that." Another panelist tapped his pen against her affidavit. "Did you make any attempt to verify?" She paused again, longer this time. "It was my understanding, based on the council's internal map, that the land was inactive." Angela stood then. "Your understanding is not equivalent to verification, and the existence of a deed is not subject to community sentiment." The room went still. The panelist nodded slowly, made a note, then moved on. The hearing ended without a final verdict. That would be issued in writing, but the tone was irreversible. Karen left the chamber looking 10 pounds heavier in defeat, her lawyer trailing behind her with the nervous detachment of a man who knew the billable hours were about to dry up. As for Mark, he walked out with Angela beside him and a subtle, unfamiliar lightness in his chest. Not joy, not yet, but relief. The kind of relief that only comes when the weight shifts off your shoulders and you realize it had nearly bent you in half. 3 days later, the verdict arrived. The council's authority was suspended pending formal reorganization. All community land use initiatives under Karen Hayes' tenure were to be paused, audited, and reviewed for legality. Karen herself was barred from participating in any municipal planning decisions for no less than 5 years. The report was written in cold, bureaucratic language, but Mark read it 3 times like it was poetry. He printed a copy, put it in a frame, and hung it above his workbench. Not out of spite, but because sometimes justice deserved a physical form. That weekend, he returned to the property. The sky was clear, and the sun cast long shadows across the cedar grove. The benches were gone. The signs, the flyers, even the painted trash bins. Everything had been removed by city order. In their place was nothing but quiet. Raw, real, rightful quiet. He stood there for a long time, breathing in the air, tracing the perimeter with his eyes. No applause, no crowd, just him and the land, as it had always been. And for the first time in months, Mark Kingsley felt what victory really meant. Not triumph, not revenge, but reclamation. A return to the simple, unassailable truth that what was his remained his. Not because he shouted the loudest or made the biggest sign, but because he stood his ground and refused to let someone else write him out of his own story. The wind shifted in early November. The leaves across the cedar grove had turned brittle and gold, gathering in slow spirals around the base of the trees, as if nature itself were reclaiming the land in quiet solidarity with its rightful owner. Mark stood on the edge of the lot, hands in his coat pockets, watching the sun break through a web of clouds. It had been nearly 2 months since the final decision, since the suspension order had gone into effect and the city began its quiet dismantling of everything that had once been branded with Karen's name. There was no press release, no grand apology. The neighborhood council had simply folded in on itself. Meetings postponed indefinitely, its pages on the city website redirected to generic placeholders. Karen's name no longer appeared on the official roster. Her resignation, when it came, was as brief and calculated as her former statements, couched in phrases like health considerations and changing priorities. But Mark didn't care for how she left. He cared that she was gone. He hadn't gone back to the meetings. He didn't need the validation. The people who had once passed him with narrowed eyes now avoided his gaze entirely, and the few who did approach him in public did so with hesitant civility, the kind reserved for people you once misunderstood but now feared might be smarter than you gave them credit for. One man, someone Mark only vaguely recognized from the grocery store, offered a quiet, "I didn't know the whole story," while fumbling for his change at checkout. Mark didn't answer, not out of coldness, but because he wasn't looking for confessions or comfort. He had done what needed to be done, and the result spoke louder than any apology ever could. The land was his again, unbothered and unbranded. No more laminated schedules, no fake plaques, no stenciled names pretending at legacy. Just cedar and wind and the crunch of frost underfoot. He'd started small projects, nothing ambitious, nothing permanent. A simple tool shed, a fire pit, gravel pathways that wound naturally with the terrain instead of carving through it like a parking lot. He didn't do it for show. He didn't even invite anyone to see it. The land was personal, and its peace wasn't meant to be shared with committee votes or neighborhood plans. It was his rhythm now, his pace. He worked slow, methodical, without deadline. Angela kept in touch, though less frequently. The final restitution payment from the city had been processed, along with a formal acknowledgement of the council's misconduct. It wasn't a fortune, but it was symbolic. She'd called it a quiet settlement, and Mark had agreed to the terms without negotiation. He didn't want a court battle, not when he'd already won something far more substantial. The proof that he wasn't crazy, wasn't difficult, wasn't in the wrong. That mattered more than the money. She'd suggested writing a public statement, maybe even an op-ed for the regional journal. People need to know what this kind of pressure looks like, she'd said. But Mark declined. Let someone else write it. He didn't need to be the face of resistance. He just needed his life back. That winter, the snow fell early. It covered the lot in thick white layers, blanketing everything with the kind of hush that reminded Mark why he'd loved this place even before the battle began. He'd visit once a week, shovel the path to the shed, and sit for an hour just watching the trees. Occasionally, he'd bring a thermos of coffee, a book he never finished, or a set of gloves if there was brush to clear. He liked it that way, unfinished, unhurried. He didn't have to protect it anymore. The land no longer needed a defender. It had outlasted the storm. One afternoon, while hauling a bundle of firewood from his truck, Mark paused to look across the boundary line where Karen's benches had once stood. Now it was just open earth, a flat plain of possibility. He thought briefly about building something. Maybe a covered space, maybe nothing at all. For the first time in a long time, the choice was entirely his. And that, he realized, was the heart of it. It had never been about a bench or a plaque or a gazebo. It had been about the right to decide what stayed, what changed, what mattered. The land was a reflection of that right, and reclaiming it had meant reclaiming himself from the slow erosion of compromise disguised as community. Later that week, a letter arrived in his mailbox. Not from the city, not from a lawyer, but handwritten on thick paper with no return address. It was from one of the volunteers who had helped install the park infrastructure, a woman named Julia who had once shouted at him during a council meeting. Her note was simple. She said she'd had time to think, that she'd never asked questions when she should have, and that she respected what he'd done even if she hadn't understood it then. There was no ask, no flattery, just that. A short truth from someone who hadn't expected him to hold the line. Mark folded the letter and placed it in the drawer where he kept the deed, the survey reports, the old photos of the gate before it was ever locked. It belonged there now, with the evidence of what was lost and what had been recovered. He didn't reply, but he remembered the name. Spring would come, and with it, green would return to the trees, and the soil would soften under his boots once again. But this time, there'd be no opposition, no hidden agendas, just quiet growth, just the sound of his own work, slow and steady, on land that had learned how to hold its ground. And so had he.